Hello, friends. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos, where we talk about communicating with people who are different than you. Since we're all unique, that's pretty much everyone. When someone has a different style of communication, they can seem like a weirdo. And if they seem like that to you, you probably seem that way to them. As I like to say, everyone is kind of a weirdo. We're going to talk about some of the assumptions we make and other pitfalls of communication so that we can all improve. There is a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos. Today with us we have Carrie Beers. She has been a leadership coach and trainer for over 40 years. That includes executive coaching, leadership development, business transformation, and strategic human resources. Her influence extends across a diverse client base, including high-tech, service, nonprofit, government, and startups, to name just a few. Carrie, welcome.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. I guess I'm
Thank
classified
you.
as a weirdo now.
Well, everyone's a weirdo, and that's what I talk
Yes,
about here.
yes.
As long as someone's different than you, they can seem like a weirdo. So, Carrie, I shortened your bio quite a bit, and I'm sure I didn't do it justice. Are there any other things you'd like to add about what you're working on these days?
Ooh, good question. I think this topic that we're going to talk about, communication, is right up my alley on what I've been doing. I've been working with companies as well as entrepreneurs, and it really starts with building relationships, and we can't do that without strong communication skills. And I've uncovered a few secrets, and I think we're going to talk about some of those today. It's more than the mechanics. I often say I wrote enough communication plans in my career that kind of stayed in the file cabinet instead of being executed because that was only a piece of it.
Yeah. Awesome, because I love secrets, and then, we're going to tell everyone, and they won't be such a secret anymore. A few weeks back, or a little while back, we had Michael Segovia from the Myers-Briggs Company, and he talked a lot about the MBTI assessment. I know that you're quite an expert on the DISC assessment. Wondering if you can walk us through that assessment a little bit, what it means, and maybe we can talk about how people can use that to improve communication.
Right. So DISC is a behavioral focused assessment, and it's had a lot of evolutions, I would say, in particular in the last 5 or 6 years, to help it become a stronger and more knowledgeable tool for the user as well as for leaders and people looking to bring people on their team. But it has four key components. You'll hear people say, are you a D, an I, a C, or an S? And so D stands for dominance, the I stands for influence, the C is conscientiousness, and the S is for steadiness. And again, it's behavior based, and it's just one dimension of communication. So as they've expanded it, we can look at the individual and we can see kind of where their strengths are going to be and where their weaknesses are going to lie as we look at their disc. But you're always a natural disc, and you're also um, I'm missing the term. You're also a natural, and you're also one that you've grown into because we are evolving.
Hmm.
So, our pure phase of who we are is supposed to be your natural. And so your natural, you'd be, if you were a D, you'd be considered dominant. If you were an I, you'd be considered an influencer. A C is conscientious, and an S is steadiness. Do we want to go into the details yet, or kind of
Yeah,
wait along?
in just a second, you were talking about kind of nature versus nurture, and is
Yes.
that what you were talking about? Someone is kind of born a certain way, and then your environment can help shift you into another direction. Is that right?
I don't want to say born because this is behavior based. I think
Okay.
there's a little bit of it because I have put a connection to genetics with some other work I do with conversations. So I'm sure it lays into disc as well. So we are naturally a style. So if you're a natural dominant style, you tend to be very direct, very results oriented, very firm, very strong willed, and very forceful. So when you think of some people that are dominants, in your life, that's somebody who probably another term they would use is director. Somebody who's very straightforward, is going after the task, not putting people in the equation. So they're really focused there. That doesn't mean they're not people, but when it comes to doing something or getting the job done, they really focus on being very direct and just diving in and going for it. And they're also big thinkers. They think at a high level. They're about the big picture, but the big picture within the realm of the scope of work they're working on. And I bring that up because then we have our influencer. And our influencer is more outgoing, they're enthusiastic, they're optimistic, they're high spirited, and they're lively. They're also big thinkers, but they're creative thinkers. Keeping them in the box is hard. Keeping a dominance person or direct person in the box is very easy because that's kind of where they like to be as long as they're driving forward. So that's a nice parallel to understand the two of them. And then you also have the conscientious person who is very analytical, very reserved, very precise, very private, very systematic and synchronized in what they do and their thinking. So a lot of people think they're definitely in the box and they're, researchers, scientists, engineers. They tend to fall into that realm of conscientiousness. Doctors, mechanics, that to me is very good because I don't want my mechanic to be an influencer and forget a part, or the doctor to take out the wrong whatever,
Right.
or give me the wrong diagnosis. So there are a lot of similarities. Excuse me, let me restate that. Both them and the dominance or director like to focus on the tasks, but the conscientious person drives to the nth degree. They want to make sure they've dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's. And I see you shaking your head because what is your style, Jeremy?
So I'm definitely a big picture person, and I know where I want to be 3 years from now. But working out all the step-by-steps, I'm not particularly interested in. So
No.
I like to work with people who like to plan out all the steps. It's just not really me.
Exactly. So you're kind of a dominance and an influence.
I think so,
So
yeah.
one of your natural is probably, I would say your natural might be more towards the dominance, and you've
Yeah.
adopted the influence over time just because we've known each other for actually quite a long time now when you think about
Yeah.
it. And then let's go to the steadiness. So the steadiness person is very even-tempered, they're accommodating, they're very patient, they're humble, and they're tactful. They're also a little more reserved, like the conscientious person. When you're sitting in a room, they're not the two people who are going to jump up and offer advice, but
Hmm.
for two different reasons. One of them is they're not direct communicators, they're indirect communicators. They're thinking and they're kind of looking like the conscientious person. They they don't want to raise their hand because they may not have been able to do the research or get comfortable with the topic before they open their mouth. And the person who's steady, the steadiness individual, they're kind of they're a little reluctant to change, and they're little bit reluctant to speak out because they're thinking of the team. They're this I like to call them home base. They're the person who everybody kind of goes to. I also like to say there's two communication tracks in a company. There's the one that we see, and there's the underground. So that steady person is the one everybody tells everything to, all their problems, all their woes. So if you
So
ever
they're
want
the
to know
water
what's
cooler
going on,
masters.
excuse me.
They're the water cooler masters.
That's a great term. I'm going to take that one from you. Yeah, so they're the ones you go to find out what the pulse of the organization is. But if you want the organization to embrace something, you're going to go to your influencer. They'll be your cheerleader and they'll get it out there and they'll get people to buy into it. So everybody has a place. And when I do training on this, I always say, can you imagine a room full of dominance people?
Ooh,
Would anything get done? No.
very.
Would
A
anything
lot of
get
fighting
done?
would get done.
Would anything get done with a room full of conscientious people?
Yeah.
Would anything get done with a room full of steady?
It takes all kinds.
It does. So a good team has a blend of all of it. And what happens often is we run into some of what I call biases, that we tend to want to hire people like us.
Hmm.
And if we have a natural D or a natural C, what our team might need is a natural I or a natural S. So we have to that's a one tool that you can really use when you're looking at it. Not to hire somebody based on that, but if they have the skills, also kind of know where they're going to fit within the team.
But that must also create some tension because people, as you said, will naturally tend towards hiring someone like themselves, and now they're hiring and working with someone very different. What are some strategies or techniques for making sure people who might be very different can communicate well and get along?
Wow, you just led me right to my whole body of work. Boom. So, one of the things I recognize is we're talking about mechanics when we talk about communications. You and I talked about that. So, when we teach communication skills, we're looking at the mechanics. We're looking at how to run a good meeting, how to put a communication plan together, how to conduct an interview, do a performance review, how to avoid conflict, or how to get out of conflict in most cases.
Hopefully
So,
avoid it, but
yeah. Well, the one way to avoid it is to know that you need all the styles. You just said it. If you had a room full of dominance people, that's conflict at its highest level. If you had a room full of influence, steadiness, or conscientious, that's conflict at its highest level. So if you understand that mechanics has a humanity component to it, the better we know ourselves and the fact that we need everybody and we need the variety, you're going to lessen that tension. And you're going to also, in the hiring process, when you go to make the hire, I think where people fail is to build the profile of the individual that they need, not just from a skill set, but from this disc set or from the humanity side. What else do I need? What do I need to round out my team so we're a force to be reckoned with?
interesting.
And
The book Good to Great, he talks about in Bethlehem Steel, they hired farmers.
yes.
Farmers didn't know anything about making steel, but they had all the traits and they could teach the skills that were needed. They were looking for the traits and totally ignoring the skill, knowing they could teach it.
And most companies do. Many still do, I should say. Most don't anymore, and many do. How's that for
It's clear as clear as
going
day.
into it? But it's so important that we have to start leaning out and leaning in. And we're just talking about one area when we're talking about behavioral skills. But when you look at this, you can also say, if I had a conscientious person and I was hiring them for a sales position, what was your first thought?
They're not going to push to get things done.
Okay. So already with our conversation, we have a bias around conscientiousness.
Hmm.
But if I was selling a very intricate piece of software, I might want that.
Right.
But I also need to make sure they understand their other roles in the sales organization. So I have to give them probably some emotional intelligence. I probably have to have them try and step out. So I couldn't hire a very high C, somebody who's very conscientious, and their nurture state was steady with the C or the S. I'd have to look for somebody who could go into my influence because they're going to be able to read the room. They're going to be able to do some things that naturally the conscientious person wouldn't have. So we want to make sure we do that full profile to understand what we're looking for and who we're looking for and why we're looking for both.
Nice. I like that. As I said, we had an interview with a person from the Myers-Briggs, and when I talked to him after it, a lot of it is understanding where you tend to be naturally, where your tendencies are, and figuring out how to kind of jump the fence and live on the other side.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's really important is we have to do that. And that's why we have the influx. From the moment we're born, our behaviors influence us. So I talked about there was a little bit of a genetic piece.
Hmm.
And one thing that DISC talks about more so, but in the 90s when I was looking at conversations and I was trying to fix a problem that I had, I couldn't really find the answer I did. And I found there's a genetic component to how we like to give and receive information. So that would also correlate in DISC with your dominant style, not your nurturing.
Oh, okay.
So I'll give you a good example. When you see, we're both from New England, so we'll say Tom Brady. I know your audience isn't, but we could say Tom Brady, Michael Jordan. Let's hit somebody on the West Coast. Kobe Bryant, was he on the West Coast, I think?
He
So we
was.
could take all those athletes. And what do you believe when you're seeing them as a professional athlete? What style do you believe they would be?
D.
Okay. Probably more of an influence there, but you're on the right thinking because they are big picture people. But in order to aspire and get to the level they are, they had to have conscientiousness as a natural.
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Because you think of Tom Brady, 4 people, I think, were for his arms, his fingers, the arm, the trajectory, his feet. Michael Jordan didn't just make all those baskets, hours and hours were spent. If you were an I or a D, you're not going to spend that kind of time, right?
Right.
So, but that's your natural. Your nurturing side on conscientious, once you become that major player, if you want to get some of the deals and you want the fans to like you and you want to do things, you can't be researching. You can't be your conscientious self. You have to step into the role of influencer.
Yeah.
So you probably learned that along the way. But if you stepped into that influencer too much when you were planning your route, you weren't going to get there.
Got it.
Right. So I
You
try
need
and
all the
use that as
steps.
an example. I always try and put people into the equation because I think it helps us remember a little differently.
Yeah. So I apologize if I didn't hear this full answer, but you mentioned that there were two parts, the mechanics, and did you talk about the other part?
Humanity,
Humanity.
the humanity of it. And so what I discovered when I started looking at that genetic component 30 years ago, I started, gee, I just kind of dated myself, huh? When I started looking at that,
Started
I
when you were 4.
realized, huh? Excuse me?
Started when you were 4.
Exactly. I was very advanced. But I started looking at it, and what I realized is that the mechanics are the end result, but they're not what gets us to great communication. Doesn't get us to good communication, even. What it is us understanding, truly understanding ourselves, because we have little innuendos. We have beliefs. We're human, and with that comes all the things. We're pushed out of the way. We're taught different things. We know our beliefs. We know our intelligence. We know the different things that we have. But what we fail to recognize is some of our emotional limitations, which is emotional intelligence. So we forget all of those things that really make us unique. But that uniqueness can get us into trouble with communication. Let me give you an example of that for you. So what I discovered is we give and receive information a certain way, but that's just part of the equation. If you're a leader, and I use this now because we had 2020 with COVID, and then we had before, so you have pre and post. If
Hmm.
you're a leader and your employee's calling in sick, what do you think about employees calling in sick?
Well, I think that everything has now switched over to just personal days, haven't they?
Well, no, not everybody. They still
Oh,
call in
okay.
sick, even if it's PTO. The policies would still say you have to notify that they're sick. Now my HR is coming out because if you
Okay.
don't segregate them a little bit, it could have some conflict later in a process
Got it.
without going too deep. So, but the point is whether they're calling in when they're calling in sick, whether it's under PTO or sick, because now most states have paid leave, so you do want to capture it. You have to know what your belief is about somebody calling in sick. If you don't, that's going to show up when you pick up that phone before you even utter a word.
Mm.
So the conversation is going to turn to conflict. Now, you also have to ask yourself, what do you feel about people who come in sick? Every coin has two sides, so you have to know them both. And
Yeah.
then you have to ask yourself, now, what do I think today with COVID? With COVID having been around. And when I ask that question, I usually get silence in the room. And I'm like, we fail communication and conversations most times before we even open our mouths. That's the humanity part. We have to know our biases and our awareness levels so that we can counteract that. And if you do that, you remove conflict. And when you're looking at DISC, you don't know somebody's natural style for that conversation necessarily, because most people are going to show more of their nurtured style because they've probably been pushed to do that in the workplace in particular when you don't get that nice of a review or they say you must participate.
Hmm.
I had a situation. There was a room full of executives that I worked with for a couple of years, and I was working on a lot of things with them, but I would be in the boardroom with them once a month. And there was one individual who didn't always participate in the lively brainstorming conversations. So this was a room about 12 or 13 people. All of them but one were either a director or an influencer. And the one person, the CTO, Chief
Hmm.
Technology Officer, was a conscientious individual.
Good.
And huh?
Good in the CTO, but tough in
That
the
was a
meeting.
bad combo anyways. That a lot of things going on in there. It was a great company. But in one time, well, one of the executives turned to me and they said, I don't think this person's a team player because they don't participate. And that
Hmm.
person knew it too. So they actually asked me to coach them on how to be a better participant in the meeting. So all those conscientious people, listen, consciousness people, the C's on disc, just go in knowing you may be asked a question and say something like, based on what I know about this now, that makes you feel comfortable and you can step into an answer. And then you end it with, if I learned something new when we leave here, I'll let you all know. And that was actually affecting the team.
I bet.
Yeah.
But as like, so I went to school for engineering, and every time you answer an engineering question, you list all of your assumptions right up front,
Mm-hmm.
and based on those assumptions, you come up with an answer. So if you communicate that, then that probably helped a long way. It allowed them to feel free to say an answer, and allowed everyone else to realize, what they were thinking.
Exactly. But in the heat of the moment, when you're brainstorming and you're doing stuff, you need to have those little cues or things that are going to help you get through,
Yeah.
and then you can always clean it up. I also say, a lot of technology people fall into the more consciousness. I'm saying it a little bit wrong. The C category. And so people will meet them at the door when they come into the office and they're like, I got a problem. You got to come to my office right away. Well, you've just scrambled their thinking
Hmm.
because you've asked them to drop everything and come over. I would change that. Even though you have to get it done, you're going to get it done better and faster if you say, listen, I have a problem. I know you just got in. If you could take 5 minutes and then maybe meet me at my office, that'd be great. Their systematic thinking starts playing out. So
Hmm.
they can drop their stuff, be thinking about it, come to you, and it's going to go much easier than you think. And conversely, if you ask an influencer to do anything, they're just going to jump in and want to do it. So isn't a
Hmm.
steadiness person. And they're going to do it because they're people oriented. And so you have to be conscientious of that when they're on your team. And the dominance and the conscientious person, they're not so people oriented. They're more task oriented. So it's, we could go on into multiple dimensions with this. DISC now, there's how to have communications with different styles, which that's what the whole program is about. But it's like how to have it in the sales conversation, how to
Oh.
have it when you're working on a project. There are multiple ways, and we got to lean into it a little bit more. And we have to remember, my favorite saying is, it's not about me. And if you can wrap your arms around that, it will help you with this.
So how do you remind yourself of that, or what do you do to remind yourself?
I think it's just innately it happens for me, but I also I've created a conversation piece, so I'm really embedded in it, and I have an observable tool that I can use. So I'll ask questions like, and when I'm working with teams, when you're doing an interview, you don't necessarily hire the right person, and it's not because they don't have the skills and they don't have everything, but you weren't asking the questions or listening in the right way. So what I tell when I'm working with an HR team right now, and I said, go through your hiring process and ask a question up front that's going to ask for detail, which is going to have you listen to what they're responding and how they're responding, and you'll be able to begin to determine what their conversation style is. So if they're giving you a lot of detail, we've already narrowed it down to two,
Yeah.
right? If they're talking about people, you've narrowed it down to two. So you do that, but on every phase of the interview, you have to do that. And you're not just asking it so you'll understand, you're going to reframe some of your questions based on their style so they can give you better answers. It's amazing this one little tool, how it permeates through an organization to make it elevate
Hmm.
just by knowing someone's disc.
Nice. I One of the things you talked in there about was asking questions, and one secret superpower I have is that people growing up really never made any sense to me. So I learned to ask a lot of questions, and I never assume that just about never assume that I understand, that I think that I really understand what someone else means without asking follow up. So it
Exactly. Probing questions are so important in that. See, I grew up a little differently. I grew up more of that influencer. And well, out of the four styles, whether you're using my system or the disc system, I have, there are four girls in my family. Each one of us was one of the styles. So it
Oh,
made me realize why we all got along, but we couldn't talk to one another.
oh, funny. Well, I'm the
Yeah.
youngest of
So
10 kids, so
I know
we
you.
had, we had some interesting dynamics going on there.
Yeah, I think we all did. And so when you're doing any kind of conversation with someone, you have to make sure you take into account their style.
Hmm.
Not necessarily their nurtured style, but you really got to find a way to get to that natural style so that you know how they like to give and receive information. I know you've worked in corporate. We both worked in corporate. If you ever left a meeting wondering what was that about,
Yeah.
more than once, I bet, right?
Yeah, trying to decipher like what happened there and why did that just happen. So, yep.
Or you're working out with someone and you're like, were you even in the same meeting? But that's because the person who now we're going to get to the mechanics a little bit. When you're planning a meeting out, you don't just have to plan the agenda, you have to plan the audience.
Hmm.
So if you know you have all four styles in the room, which you most likely do, you got to make sure you cover points that are going to keep the influencer and engaged because you'll lose them very quickly.
Yep.
Keep the dominator and the dominance person director engaged because they're going to want to check out if you're giving too many details, but give enough for the conscientious person and steady. So when I do this training, I usually point out to people in my script what I just did. I have a specific point where I use all four descriptions without telling anybody. And then I point out how, right before I was going on and on because it was a particular point. So I lost my directors and my influences or dominances and influencers. I had to bring them back with a wow. So I had to go to
Hmm.
the big picture. So now it's okay if my conscientious or steadiness checked out because I gave them what they needed right before. So you
Hmm.
have to manage that when you're doing any kind of speaking. When I do speaking gigs here today, you notice I've gone in detail, but I've also stayed high a little bit as we're talking about some things.
Excellent. You have mentioned a couple times, we've been talking about this, but you mentioned your
Hmm.
assessment or tool. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So this what prompted all of this in the 90s was I was working for an engineering company. Now remember I started with my natural style is an I, an
Hmm.
influence, and I was working in a uh very much conscientious a C organization. We were automating manufacturing lines, and I had just done a presentation. I had just been promoted to VP of HR. I was doing a presentation, and I came out and I immediately went to the CEO's office, and I was like, "I nailed that." And he said, "Did you?"
Ouch.
So I didn't say out loud, maybe I didn't. I just kind of looked at him and he goes, "You didn't understand your audience." And I said, "I've been working with them for 2.5 years. I know my audience." And he goes, "No, you didn't understand them." Now, normally he's a D, so he just wants to get down to the bottom of it. He said, "You know what? Let's reconvene tomorrow at 10." And I was like, "What?" So I was on my way back to my office and probably six or seven people stopped me for clarification on the conversation that we just had. And
Oh, wow.
understanding kept running through my mind. Well, there were 250 people in the audience. So by 10 o'clock the next morning, I'd say 100 of them came to me and asked me for clarification or sent me emails.
Wow.
So I went back in to his office and I said, I think I know what I did. And I did know DISC and I knew Myers Briggs at the time. I said, I didn't want to say understand, but I had to give him that word. I said, I didn't really understand my audience. He goes, no, you didn't. He goes, you hit every point. You absolutely hit every point. You were engaging. You had people laughing. He goes, but you hit all the points the way you like to.
Mm.
You didn't look at your audience on how they need to hear that information. So that set me on my quest to find that piece that I was missing. And I learned that there was a genetic component. At the time, DISC was more structured and it was more complicated to kind of move through, as
Hmm.
Myers Briggs was too. There wasn't anything easy. So I created it's what's your conversation personality style. And I do give an assessment, but then I build the training similar to what we were just talking about, I have you learn how to observe behaviors. I learned how this is at your core, how you give and receive information. This is only for conversations, this piece. It doesn't take into account your being a good team member or stuff, but it does in that conversation. So we learn what our style is, and then I walk through ways for you to learn how to observe others, how to look at different things they're doing, how they talk, their tones, how they're moving through. I always put people in the equation because that's how we think. Tell stories so that you can kind of put somebody with it. So I started that in the 90s, and it's still very relevant today. When I work with a team on that, they immediately walk out of the room knowing how to use the tool. And in fact, I tell them to use it on their families to practice. And one woman came in, she had been going to lunch with her sister-in-law on a Friday afternoon every Friday for 30 years. And she came in one day, she goes, "You have saved my family." And I'm like, "I don't really know what you're talking about." And she said, "We had no idea that we were talking to each other the wrong way. So their
Hmm.
lunch always ended in conflict. And the family corrected that conflict throughout the weekend." So she handed me a card, and everyone in the family had signed it, thanking me for
Oh,
turning this
nice.
person onto this tool. And then a little later, I was with another company, and again, I give it to everybody. And the person said, "My fiance and I were having an argument, and I had him do the assessment." I give everybody all kinds of things to hang up to get to know, so you don't have to give the assessment. The goal is you don't need the assessment. If you're on a sales conversation, you can't say, "Hey, can you take this so I can sell to you better?" They're
Yeah.
not going to fly with that. But if you have the tools how to uncover who they are, you'll be able to use it. So she said we were having an argument, and I dragged them into the kitchen where I hung our two, this is what I like, this is what you like. And I pointed, "Look, you've got to let me talk." And she said, "And it was the best conversation we ever had." And I was like, "Are you still engaged?"
Nice.
But it worked. So those are just, little things to do. Disc is doing that now also, but I find that with the tool that I did, it immediately, like people, I've done it where people said, "Can we put characters to it?" So they pick animals, or they pick Harry Potter, or they pick Disney characters. So they're making it their own unique way. And when you
Hmm.
can have that immediate impact on a company, that's huge, because the ripple effect is the interview skills, the
Yeah.
performance reviews, the calling in sick. It begins to change immediately. It not only elevates the individual's skill, but it elevates the business's results immediately. So that is my little tool that I use that is still relevant.
And is that something that's accessible to people in general, or they need to work with you to be able to take that?
Great question. I am working on an automated system for it. Right now, people would have to contact me. I know you'll be giving them how to work with me. I do conversation. I'll be having a special coming up the end of the year for individuals to attend a session,
Oh, good.
and things. And it's not, I don't just use this in companies. I want to get it out to the masses, because when I said we have to use humanity and we put that equation in, we have relationships everywhere. And, relationships are all about understanding ourselves at our truest point. And my mom said to me, I can't believe I'm doing this. My mother said, communication is more than the mechanics of things. She said, "Carrie, you can never be in a great friendship. You can't be a great daughter. You can't be a wonderful sister until you really look at yourself and you are aware of who you are." And little did I know in the 90s, when I started all this research, it was going to come back to what mom said. So you have to know who you are before you can really be of value to the other person you're trying to talk to. And DISC is just one piece of that equation, as is my conversation personality style.
Did you get to tell your mom that she was right?
No, unfortunately, well, I did. Yes, I did, but not in the bigger picture that I saw. She had passed away before that, but she knows.
Oh, sorry to hear
Somehow I
that.
think she was there putting it on my shoulder to remember that she
Yep,
told me
pushing,
hundreds of times.
guiding you along. All right, Carrie, this has been fantastic, but we need to wrap up to keep
Sure.
to time. So, three questions I ask everybody, and this one is part A and B. What's one of the favorite places you've traveled to, and a place you would love to go but haven't been yet?
Mm. So my favorite, I always have trouble with this answer because in fifth grade I fell in love with the United States. we had to know every capital in every state, and we did projects on it and things. So my goal is to get into every state and really, 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 really get to know the state and all the monuments. So one of the places I have been is to Lake Shasta in California. And
Yeah.
I have to say that is probably one of the most amazing places that I've seen the because of the way the water is there, and you could be so high up, and it's almost like a mini canyon because that's how canyons are created. So that has been one of the most beautiful places. And where I still want to go, I'm going to step out of the US. And I got this from a client. We were both taking our first cruise together, not together,
Mhm.
but I was going to the Bahamas and he was going on a Mediterranean cruise from Greece to Italy or Italy to Greece. I can't remember which. And his enthusiasm about both of us going on our first cruise together, we lived those cruise dynamics with each other. So I do want to do that Mediterranean cruise um,
Nice.
from Greece to Italy. Yeah, he was as excited about our little Bahama cruise as he was about his. I was like, "Oh, okay."
It's all good. All travel's good. Can always
Yes.
learn something. Second question is who is a person who you find to be a great communicator, whether it's in your personal life or a public figure?
You mean aside from you and I?
Other than us, who are the third and fourth best,
Third
maybe?
and fourth. No, I'll give you the third. I have to say Oprah Winfrey.
Ah,
I have followed her since the day she started on the talk show and following her philanthropic endeavors. And she just has always been able to articulate and to really wrap her hands around an audience. And I think when you can do that, it's like you're having a one-on-one conversation with that individual. And I can't think of a better person at communicating.
that's come up a number of times in different episodes that you're always having a one-on-one conversation. Even if you're having 10,000 of them at the same time, it's always just one-to-one.
Exactly,
Nice.
exactly.
And then last is, what is one piece of advice you think everyone could benefit from around communication?
Other than reaching out to me or you for communications training, I'll give you one. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that. But I think the advice is what we've talked about. Let the mechanics be,
Hmm.
until you truly understand yourself, until you truly put the humanity piece into conversations, you're going to lose. Because everything in communication starts with a relationship. And like my mom said, you can't be a good anybody until you truly understand who you are.
Wonderful. All right, Carrie. So now is your opportunity to let everybody know where they can go to learn more about you and or reach out.
Sure. You can always go to Carrie Beers Consulting. That's my website, carriebeersconsulting.com. I don't know if I got that right. You're going to post that though first, right?
I'm going
You
to
can
put it
reach
in the
me
show
by
notes.
you can reach me by email at carriebeersconsulting.com, or LinkedIn is probably the quickest and easiest way to connect, and just message me. I'd love to hear what people think and if they want to add any value to this conversation that we had.
Yeah, I'm always interested in getting people's feedback and, maybe they have a different perspective and maybe they'll tell me something that will make me want to invite them onto the show next time.
Exactly. And I will say, we just touched a small piece of disc
Oh,
today.
yeah.
Hmm.
It's a whole world of things to talk about and learn about. So that's why we're going to have a bunch more episodes.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Carrie, it has been wonderful having you. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to another episode of How to Talk to Weirdos. I really appreciate you being here. Please reach out to me on my LinkedIn, which is Jeremy Doran Speaks, or find me on my webpage, jeremydoranspeaks.com. I want to hear from you. I would love some feedback. Tell me what you think and tell me what you want me to talk about next. Until next week, enjoy talking to some weirdos.